And I would now like to introduce Dave Vago, who is an instructor at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School here in Boston. Dave also worked with the Mind and Life Institute for a couple of years, and he's doing some really interesting work working on a framework of mindfulness. So really bringing the pieces together and looking at how is it that mindfulness meditation works. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Britta. Thank you, Bessel, for inviting me. So I'm going to really focus. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and maybe paint broader strokes with trying to synthesize and integrate what Mo, Britta, and Tim were talking about. So generally speaking, there are two models for cultivating mindfulness in the context of meditation practices. We have a 2,500-year-old model, which is depicted here in the Tibetan Thangka painting. Here's coming from Neurobiological Institute in Dharamsala. And we have a more contemporary 25-year-old model, which is heavily influenced by John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is represented here on the screen. And so really the good news here is the concept of mindfulness is permeating through all of popular culture. And that's very good. That's great news. However, there's some not so good news. Number one being that the concept is somewhat trivialized in popular culture. And it's often, the concept itself is often conflated with terms such as acceptance, non-judgment, non-reactivity. So what do we really mean by mindfulness if there's all these conflated terms that go along with it? And really, there's actually no single correct or authoritative version of mindfulness out there. That may be a bold statement, and that's coming from John Donne, a Buddhist scholar. So not from the Buddhist literature or from contemporary sciences is there really a definitive sort of way to describe mindfulness at this point. So we're really interested in trying to break this down. In the extant literature today, in the contemplative sciences, what we're doing when we try to understand mindfulness, there's also a problem. We describe mindfulness as a state, something that's cultivated while we're practicing the meditation. There's mindfulness described as a trait, which is basically a dispositional sort of enduring cognitive and emotional way of processing information. And it can be also described as a type of meditation. So these semantic differences and these semantic problems really create some sort of difficulty in the laboratory setting when we're trying to really understand how mindfulness specifically, or the practices of meditation, are any different from, say, cognitive behavioral therapy or other traditional forms of therapy. So the research that I'm going to focus on today and what I'm presenting essentially addresses this problem, and it creates, and what we're trying to do here is create a model, a theoretical and conceptual framework for understanding mindfulness that focuses more on the specific practices, the meditation practices that are being used in these interventions. And broadly speaking, we're really talking about the goals of the practice, which is reducing suffering and increasing a flourishing mind or a healthy mind. So that's how I'm thinking about mindfulness. And so I, rather than focusing on reducing the construct down to one process or one particular area of the brain or what mindfulness is doing specifically in sort of a unidimensional way, myself and Britta and Tim and others have been really thinking about it at a multidimensional level. There is complex systems involved underlying the practices themselves. So that's what I focus on. And in this context, I focus specifically on the processing of the self and use that framework of self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence and the underlying neural systems for those processes to really get an idea of what mindfulness is doing. Okay. So I'm going to start a little bit with some conceptual clarifications for mindfulness. Some of them were already alluded to by Tim and Britta, and I'm just going to probably just breeze through those. This is a workshop, so if you feel like you want to stop me, please do, and we can clarify a little bit further together. So I'll then talk about what a dysfunctional self is and how that may relate to a clinical model of what you may experience with your patients, either in trauma or in something like depression. And then I'll talk a little bit about the framework that I'm using here, the self-awareness, regulation, and transcendence, and how that may provide a framework for mindfulness, understanding it, and for an adaptive self-functioning. I'll go through some of the models for meditation practice so we understand. So like I said, we're focusing specifically on the practices that are thought to cultivate mindfulness. So I will talk about the concentration practices, receptive-based practices, and ethical enhancement-based practices, 3 practices that I'll get into a little bit more, specifically that are thought to cultivate mindfulness. And we'll focus specifically on those. And then some conclusions. Okay, so as I've been alluding to, mindfulness can be described as a state, a trait, a process, it's an intervention, or is it really just an emerging field of study? Is that what we're talking about when we talk about mindfulness? Now, what I find helpful is to really go back into the practices from which mindfulness originate. And if we have to do that, we talk about a little bit of Buddhism. Meditation is actually just an English word, and it has an origin, its etymology really comes from the Sanskrit bhavana, which is causing to become, or cultivation, mental development, and the Tibetan word gom, which is the development of familiarity. So most of the traditional emphasis from the Buddhism focuses on mental development and the cultivation of familiarity, a deep level of familiarity with one's own self, with one's own mind, and one's own mental landscape. So that's really the meditation practice, that's what the meditation practices are doing, helping you become familiar with your own mind and patterns of behavior. And that's really what mindfulness is grasping onto as well. One Buddhist scholar defines mindfulness as an essential faculty that's cultivated along with other things like wisdom, perceptual clarity, and equanimity. So when I'm talking about mindfulness, and when we're all talking about mindfulness, we're actually talking about multiple dimensions of processes, and which all have underlying neural substrates that we can get into. The actual word, mindfulness, is translated from the Pali and Sanskrit satis and smrti, and that refers to just that which is remembered or the process to remember. So that certainly comes into play into the actual meditation practice. It's certainly a critical part of the practice, but it's not the entire game. Alan Wallace, a Buddhist scholar, also describes mindfulness as a non-conceptual meta-awareness that does not label or categorize experiences and involves attending continuously to a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. So keep that in mind as we go through. That's the Buddhist, remember we have the 2 models, the 2,500-year-old model and the 25-year-old contemporary model. So that's really coming from more the 2,500-year-old model. And then the other definition, of course, is the one we're all familiar with, both Tim and Britta alluded to, is John's definition, which really talks about multiple processes, not just attention, it's not just awareness, it's not just acceptance, it's not just non-reactivity, it may be all of those things if we really focus on the practices that cultivate mindfulness. Okay. This is a slide that comes from our friend and collaborator, Nick Van Dam, who's doing a lot of statistical work on trying to understand the concept of mindfulness through self-report measures. At this point, we have 8 different measures of mindfulness that measure dispositional levels of trait mindfulness, 8. And they're often uncorrelated with each other. This happens to be one of them, coming from Ruth Baer, that we think that we've created these sort of concepts that we think are related to mindfulness, acting with awareness, non-reactivity, non-judgment, describing experience. And the idea here is that we want to find a common underlying feature of mindfulness. And again, this is from Nick Van Dam's talk that he graciously let me borrow. The idea here is that there's a common substrate, an underlying factor, and that's what we're trying to understand. However, a lot of these statistical analyses seem to suggest that there may not always be a common factor of mindfulness, and that there's some evidence that the factors might actually be interpreted differently by meditators and non-meditators. So as nice as self-report measures are and as easy as they are to implement, they don't necessarily represent the things that we think they do. Okay, so this is a problem in the field right now, is that self-report is not the best way to sort of get an idea of mindfulness. There are some cases where drunk college students actually have more mindfulness, dispositional mindfulness, than experienced practitioners with thousands of hours of practice under their belt. So this is where we're at. This is the problem, and so we have to really start to refine our models of and conceptions of mindfulness so we can better objectively measure it. So, and this is also, I really like to show this quote, because when you talk to John Kabat-Zinn, he always emphasizes this, and he did from the beginning. And I'll just read this to you. So we use the word mindfulness intentionally as an umbrella term to describe our work. By umbrella term, I mean that it is used in certain contexts as a placeholder for the entire Dharma that is meant to carry multiple meanings and traditions simultaneously. So even when you talk to him today, he'll say the same thing. He's basically saying that mindfulness does not necessarily mean memory, or it doesn't necessarily mean awareness or acting through acceptance or non-judgment. It's everything related to the meditation practices. By doing the practices, you will gain mindfulness. But you also gain equanimity, you gain sensory clarity, and a lot of other things will sort of manifest as well. And so what I'm really trying to focus on is the actual goal of the meditation practices, which are reducing suffering and creating a healthy mind. Okay. And here's a quote by the Dalai Lama. The whole purpose of meditation is to lessen the diluted afflictions of our mind and eventually eradicate them from their very roots. By learning and practicing the profound and vast aspects of teaching, a practitioner with prolonged familiarity with and meditation on selflessness eventually gains an understanding of reality. So I'm just going to focus on a few of these things. So diluted afflictions of our mind. If we start with that assumption, then we have a clinical model that we can work with, that we all have some level of diluted afflictions of our mind. Some of these may manifest on one extreme as psychopathology. Others may be able to get by in life, but still have these sort of diluted aspects of mental processing, and we'll get into what we mean by that. And then what are the ways of dealing with that diluted nature, and we'll get into that as well. So again, remember, we're talking about two different models, a 2,500-year-old model and a 25-year model. So from the Buddhist model, the older model, the diluted afflictions of our mind refer to habitual attachment or aversion to sensory mental events. It refers to a lack of awareness or ignorance of the idea of impermanence, that all phenomena arise and pass, as does oneself, and that the self is actually an independent and permanent entity that based on an inflated sense of self-importance or self-loathing. And one Buddhist scholar points out that the aims of these meditation practices are to achieve stability of mind, a deeply penetrating awareness between laxity and hyper-excitability, followed by a cessation of maladaptive emotions and cognitions, such as lustful desire, greed, hatred, worry, etc., the cultivation of virtuous qualities, and finally the highest form of wisdom, in which the practitioner perceives the most fundamental nature of objects as they truly are, without distortions or biases inherent in habitual forms of cognition. So I want to stress the biases inherent in habitual forms of cognition. So if we begin with the assumption that our perception and cognitions related to our ordinary experiences are distorted or biased to varying degrees, then we have a pathological model. And what that Buddhist model should look familiar to you all who are trained therapists. There's a cognitive model of psychopathology that Beck introduced in 1976, and he talks specifically about the same sort of delusions. The processing of external events or internal stimuli is biased and therefore systematically distorts the individual's construction of his or her experiences, leading to a variety of errors: overgeneralization, selective abstraction, personalization. Underlying these distorted interpretations are dysfunctional beliefs incorporated into relatively enduring cognitive structures or schemas. So one thing that I'm going to target really for these meditation practices is the enduring cognitive structures or schemas, okay, and what mindfulness can do to actually unravel those. One of the mechanisms that Mo and Britta were really referring to were exposure and extinction, and I think those are one of the critical sort of mechanisms that mindfulness is really getting at. Okay, so I should just point out that Beck also created this model showing that, similar to what Mo and Tim and Britta really were talking about, was that even you can have a genetic predisposition here that could lead to these types of biases. It could lead just to have a more reactive amygdala, which if you create these hardened structures of bias in your cognitive system, that will lead to an exaggeration of stressful events in life. Ordinary experience is going to be stressful. You'll activate the HPA axis more readily. There'll be dominance of limbic activity over prefrontal function. There'll be deficient reappraisal or control mechanisms, and then it could lead to depressive outcomes or things like PTSD. This is also, there's also a developmental aspect of this. So this is how he describes how through certain experiences in life, for example, trauma, one can also create these cognitive biases. And that could also happen so developmentally. So we're talking about a genetic predisposition and a developmental model here. That both of these need to be understood. Okay, so when we get back to the self, because that's really what I've been focusing on, we have to think about how these habits form. How do we create these structures and schemas of these cognitive biases? How do they come about? Well, if we have a conception of me and self, we also have a conception of our past and where we come from. And then we also think about our future and where we're going. So just that alone creates a structure of self for all of us, a self-identity, where we came from, who we are, what our past experiences are, and how we interpret them. And they could be very different from how you or I see someone else's experiences. And this creates a causal chain, because then me continues on through life, and they influence each other. And using Beck's triad of outlook towards oneself, that's negative, I'm worthless, life is unfair, and my future is hopeless. All of these types of thoughts at each moment in time creates a particular experience that has a negative feedback loop on one's past, self-reflection, and one's future. This creates dysfunctional attitudes, rumination, and negative self-focus. And what this really is what you're doing is you're reifying the self. You're creating a narrative, and that narrative from the past and for your future experiences is now negative. And this has a lot of implications at a clinical level. So here's the question. What are the cognitive and neurobiological pieces of the puzzle that make up mindfulness and the associated skill set targeting a dysfunctional system of self and developing a healthy mind? So there's a path. It's clearly outlined in the 2,500-year-old model. There's a path that's created even in the 25-year model, and it just really relates to the practices at hand. Now, one of the first practices that I'll talk about is a focused attention meditation, and I'll describe exactly what's happening in that process. But from the 2,500-year-old model, I come back to this Tibetan Thangka painting. This is the model that's been out there for 2,500 years of how to stabilize one's mind and reduce mental proliferation, reduce rumination. For the sake of time, I won't go through the entire thing, but it's a beautiful depiction of a meditation practitioner who is attempting to tame a wild elephant as he walks along the path. And I'll just mention a few little items on here to give you a sense of what we're talking about that might help. The practitioner is holding a rope to tame the elephant. The rope represents mindfulness, and the elephant represents the mind. And like a wild elephant can create a lot of havoc if it's running through the streets. So can a mind that's not tamed. So the idea here is that he's using mindfulness as a tool to tame the mind. The mind is also, the elephant is also being led by a monkey, which represents distraction. When we close our eyes, like we all experienced with Britta this a little earlier today, I'm sure we all had a little bit of that elephant running around and the monkey jumping from one thought to another. And that's the idea of monkey mind, is that it's a lot of distraction. The black nature of the elephant represents the dullness of the mind. And as you continue along the path, it becomes more white and more clear. You gain more sensory clarity. One of the things that Tim mentioned that I really hope to stress is that there was a difference between novice practitioners and advanced practitioners. And that's another aspect of the model that we need to think about, because they look different and their brains are going to be different. So we can't say that all meditation practitioners are going to look the same. There's going to be very different neural substrates associated with novice practitioners who are just exposed to 3 minutes of meditation versus 20 years of 2 hours of meditation a day, which happens to turn out to be about 15,000 hours. So the idea here is that in the beginning, there's a fire, and the fire is really high, and that means that there's a lot of effort. So effort is also incorporated into the model because meditation with harmful, in the context of harmful emotions requires effort, some sort of suppression. But as you continue along the path, the fire sort of disappears because it becomes less effortful. And that sort of relates also to what Tim was saying with the non-appraisal and these things that happen later on, that the amygdala is even active later on in long-term practitioners, because all the amygdala is doing is not noticing that there's some sort of salience in the context. It's not necessarily expressing fear, just noting, yes, there is some sort of pain or some sort of emotional stimulus present. So that gives you a sense. And there's 10 stages here, and then eventually the elephant or the mind is tamed and sitting by the side of the practitioner, and that's when the next stage of meditation is ready. You're ready. The practitioner is ready to perform the next stage of meditation, which is insight meditation, which is also different than the focused attention meditation, which is more focused on stabilizing the mind, calming the mind, mental tranquility. Okay, so that's the Buddhist model. So now some of us may be familiar with these evidence-based mindfulness interventions. There's mindfulness-based stress reduction, which we alluded to already, and so did Britta, and I'll go into a few details. There's MBCT that was really effective for preventing relapse. Interestingly, there's a criteria there that you need to have at least 3 major depressive episodes for it to be effective to prevent relapse. There's mindfulness-based relapse prevention for addiction. There was the relaxation response, which Herb Benson was certainly a pioneer in the field to talk about mindfulness using sort of different terminology, but he calls it mindfulness these days, I believe. There's acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, which is based on really accepting one's thoughts. And there's Marshall Linehan's dialectical behavior therapy, which has been really effective for borderline. So these are all evidence-based mindfulness interventions based on the 25-year model. What does it actually entail? What's going on in these clinical interventions? It's actually 62 hours of sitting practice, yoga, and inquiry. And Britta also talked a little bit about this, but I thought I'd just re-emphasize what it really entails, because that's what we're trying to get at. Exactly what you're doing, and how can we tease that apart? What's the critical point here that's happening? Is it just the fact that you have a charismatic instructor? I mean, if you took a meditation class with Britta, would you get better just because she's Britta? Possibly. But, so these are the things we need to tease apart. Is it the meditation itself? There's 26 hours that's happening in the weekly classes, plus the all-day 6-hour class. And home practice, 45 minutes a day, which rarely happens, but that's what's prescribed. And there's 3 practices, typically concentration, insight, and ethical. Body scan is usually associated there too. And light hatha yoga. And so we can't underemphasize the yoga, because we know that there's some studies out there that actually show that the yoga actually has greater effect sizes on some of the outcomes than than the sitting practice. So the yoga is definitely a very powerful part of this story. The other thing I wanted to say about this is that there's now been studies that show that the number of hours that are actually used in these interventions don't necessarily predict better outcomes. So it's not like the more hours you practice in the 8 weeks, the better outcomes there have been. And that's not the case. Depending on the population, for example, I did a study with fibromyalgia patients, and they could not sit like everyone else, nor could they do some of the hatha yoga. So we had to adapt to the particular population. And they also benefited, but we had to adapt to that population. And so there have been studies by Ruth Baer, for example, that show that the amount of time spent in the intervention does not correlate necessarily with the outcomes. So something to consider. Okay, so I'm going to now focus on the practices, 3 of the practices that are emphasized. You have the focused attention meditation, which is single-pointed. Now, in the way it's traditionally described, it can be on any particular point of concentration. It can be a deity, a flame, a shape. It could be a mantra, a sound. It could be anything. This is where Christian contemplative traditions also come into play here as well. Then there's the open monitoring meditation, which is more receptive. I say receptive because it doesn't require focused attention, it's ambient attention, and I'll describe that. And these are sometimes described as non-dual practices, like Dzogchen, Mahamudra, more of the Tibetan practices. Shikantaza is a Zen practice where they don't give you an instruction except for just sit. And that's the instruction. It doesn't matter what you do, just sit. And then there's these ethical enhancement meditation practices, which include loving kindness, Tonglen, forgiveness practice, and compassion. And so each of those also have some sort of ethical and moral enhancement going on, increasing prosociality, empathy, theory of mind, and things like that. So we'll get into those details. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the actual models for these particular practices. So as we begin here, what I want to emphasize is that the process of the meditation practice begins with a framework of motor learning or conditioning that basically is the same as learning a skill, riding a bike. The more you do it, the better you get at it, the more automatized it becomes. And that's the main premise behind the practice. The more you do it, the better you become at it. And that's one of that's the framework that we're working from. Now, foundationally, there also has to be, and what's traditionally described as some form of motivation and positive intention of the practice, which influences the entire practice. And this puts you in a particular positive trajectory or orientation towards doing the practice. So it's also something that we need to study. It's not just attention and emotion regulation, but we have to see, well, what's the intention? What's the motivation behind doing the practice? Where is that, and how? And can we measure those things? So the next aspect of the model that we're focusing on here is set formation. And set formation really is the practice instructions. And it's an executive process. And so it has its own neural substrates. And everything that I'm describing here, keep in mind that it has its own neural substrates associated with it. So we can study each one of these cognitive processes through very specific neural systems. So set formation, now you have particular practice instructions of what you should be doing. You really now need to be doing what you should be doing. And that requires focused attention and working memory. And so the focused attention keeps your mind on the object. Working memory is a process that allows you to maintain or to reduce your forgetfulness and maintain your practice instructions throughout the time that you're sitting. Now, there are very specific processes that can be disambiguated and can be measured in terms of attention and bias. And these are specifically have been outlined by Mike Posner and others as orienting and engagement with a particular object. So you can disambiguate those to particular substrates in attention. And there has been some work by Mishi Jha who's been showing that orienting has actually been improved with meditation practice. So you orient, you engage with an object, and in this case the intended object is the breath. And then the next instruction is to sustain. That's the instruction. Sustain your attention on the breath. Now, that's an iterative process, and that's what you're intended to do. However, the guy who cut you off, on the steroid drive before you got here this morning. And then you have some sort of valence, which could be negative. Maybe it's positive, but there can also be a neutral response. Some sort of valence is associated with that effective response. Of course, there's some sort of physiological change with that, but it's really a replay of some sort of episodic memory and the associated physiological change. Now, this whole process of being distracted and having an effective response is what's thought of as mental proliferation. And in our lingo, in the clinical model, we think of this as rumination. So we're all very familiar with what happens when we ruminate. And there's very specific neural substrates associated with that. So we can look at how much rumination is going on, how much of the neural substrates associated with rumination is occurring during the practice or outside of the practice. So critical to this whole process is the executive monitor. So I said that there is some sort of executive functioning going on when you just form set, and then you actually have to maintain that set. But now you're actually asked to monitor what's going on, and this requires some level of awareness or meta-awareness of the process of meditation itself. And what we think that's happening is that over time, as you strengthen this executive monitoring system, that there's going to be some sort of detachment from identification with a self, that there is a decentering or psychological distancing or reperceiving. It's been called all three of those in different contexts that goes on. And this sort of witness perspective, this distancing that happens between you and your process, is probably one of the critical mechanisms that's occurring in the meditation practice, but it may also be common with other types of therapeutic changes as well. So if you're doing yoga and dance with children, then that could also be some sort of critical process that manifests. It's not clear. There certainly may be some overlap. It may not be specific to just meditation practice, but it is one of the critical mechanisms. And in the Buddhist model, this decentering process has sometimes been thought of as de-reification. So remember I said you have a reified self that is created, a narrative self that's created. Well, you're de-reifying. You're now unraveling the self. So there's certain processes that need to be activated in response to that distraction. And response inhibition and emotion regulation have very specific substrates, as Mo and Britta were pointing out, and we can look at those particular substrates associated with that. And then again, we have to model the effort that decreases over time, as well as the increased level of sensory clarity and equanimity that change as well over the practice. So that's focused attention meditation. That's what's happening when we sit and we focus on the breath. Okay, so now we have the open monitoring meditation. It's going to be very similar, so I'll go through it a little bit more quickly, but I'll focus on the differences specifically. So again, we have motor learning as a framework, intention and motivation, set formation. Now we have, instead of focused attention, we have ambient attention. Okay? It's a more distributed form of attention. It's not focused on any particular object. It's open towards very specific modalities of internal and external experience. And in this case, I break it down visual, auditory, and somatic. So you can have external visual information going on outside of yourselves, and you can have internal mental imagery. Similarly, you can have internal mental chatter, which is auditory, or you can have external sound. Somatic feeling states, some visceral somatic internal states. You can have awareness of what's going on inside you. Every emotion can have a very somatic marker for it, or you can have some sort of external touch or pain that you can be attending to. You can also, what's typically taught in this type of practice is mental noting and labeling, all three of those modalities. So we could even go back and forth and do it socially and just say seeing, hearing, feeling, and you can then be more specific and say seeing in, seeing out, feeling in, and you can do this back and forth, and that there's actually a social noting technique that some Buddhist practitioners will do. And now critically, there's a refined ability through time to notice the arising and the passing of these phenomena. So if you have some sort of sensory and mental event occur, you can actually be more refined and note exactly when it arises, when it is present, and when it passes. And some practitioners, as you get more advanced, can actually note just the rest, the absence of a specific modality. I am now focusing on just the absence of inner mental chatter. And they can sustain that for long periods of time. So that's also a very common technique. And then there's disengagement, again, an aspect of attention processing that you can look at specifically. It turns out that there's some studies that suggest that many forms of psychopathology have trouble disengaging from information that drives the pathology. So for example, chronic pain patients have a problem disengaging from pain-related information, pain-related words, for example. They get stuck. Like we said, there's mental proliferation, there's rumination. They get stuck processing it. If they're not avoiding it, because there's a hypervigilant avoidant model that we can talk about, that at first they're very hypervigilant. They're going to see whenever there's pain-related information, or for trauma patients, very specific information related to trauma. But then there's avoidance. And so that's something that once they're able to actually engage with that particular concept, then they sometimes have problems disengaging because they're ruminating. So there's multiple things going on in this sort of affective chronometry or experience with phenomena that happens at the millisecond level before you even have conscious awareness. There's avoidance. There's models now that show that within 150 milliseconds, you can be avoiding sensory information. That's pretty phenomenal because that means that you don't even know that you're avoiding. And then once you actually engage with that object, then you may have trouble releasing. So there's a very different sort of time frame that we have to think about, that it's different depending on when you're looking. So again, you have this distraction and affective response that is very habitual. These are the cognitive biases that we were referring to, and this is the rumination. And again, the decentering, the monitoring, critical aspects of the practice, response inhibition, emotion regulation, in the same sort of levels of decreases in effort, increases in clarity and equanimity. Okay, so, and that really should lead us to insight. And so insight really is, again, gaining the deep level of familiarity with oneself and one's own mental processes. All right, and those are the two meditation practices that cultivate mindfulness, period. And I have this disappearing after a while because the mental noting and labeling, as you become more advanced, you become less reliant on that process. And then actually there's the difference between engagement on a mental phenomena and disengagement will also disappear through time. So that's something you can also measure. So what emerges here through these practices? And we have self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence. And this is sort of the way I've been thinking about it as a novel framework for understanding the neurobiological processes underlying meditative practices that really cultivate mindfulness. And so one of the things that this relates to is back to our clinical model, our cognitive model of psychopathology. In this case, we're using Beck's triad. I am worthless, I'm a burden to my family, why bother? All these things, these sort of negative outlooks and the negative feedback loops. Well, how do we target and unravel these types of negative perceptions? Well, through these practices of mindfulness, equanimity, clarity, and the decentering process, the psychological distancing that allows you to extinguish and reconsolidate a new version of self, a new interpretation of self. So there may be some reappraisal going on, and later on, once the reappraising has done its job, you may not need to do much reappraising anymore and just accept and observe. And so self-regulation and self-awareness are really critical to that process. And then you create a positive feedback loop. I'm successful, I am motivated, I am a good person. And so we're removing our misperceptions of the self. And we realize that these are just distorted interpretations, and we should have a big smiley face once we're done with that. And so there's also what happens in most of these ethical-based practices of compassion. I didn't show you any models specifically for compassion, but loving kindness, if you're not familiar with loving kindness, is really just a matter of sharing love and kindness with oneself, close others, strangers, people who you dislike, And that process will actually dissolve the distinction between self and other. So when you look in the brain for substrates of the self, and I'm not sure if I'll have time to do that, but you'll see that there is a distinction between how we conceptualize ourselves versus another person. If it's a person who you are very close to, like a sister, a brother, a relative, close relative, then your brain actually will look very similar to oneself. It looks pretty much identical. So I show you a list of adjectives that you say, yes, that looks like me, that looks like me, that looks like me. Oh yeah, it looks like my mom, looks like my mom, looks like my mom. Your brain looks almost identical in terms of the neural substrates related to self and other in that context. Now, if I showed you adjectives that describe the Queen of England, that really has nothing to do with you, then it's going to look slightly different. The substrates will look different, and there's sort of a distinction there that's made that people make. What happens, at least it's hypothesized, we don't have real evidence for this yet, is that there would be a dissolved distinction between self and other through practice over time. And so me and you actually will be one and the same in terms of how our brain looks at it. And these really have to do with increasing prosociality, increasing theory of mind, understanding empathy, empathic sort of forms of emotional contagion. All these types of processes will dissolve the distinction between self and other. And that's what we mean by self-transcendence. Okay, so this was a paper that Britta pointed out, really trying to outline the actual processes that are underlying meditation practice. So we're working with, we're really trying to think about meditation and mindfulness by breaking it down and deconstructing it into its component parts. And we also have a paper that's under review that will also have basically everything that I've been showing you here today. And the idea here is that there are probably multiple things that we can study, multiple components, neurocognitive components that we can study. So like I said, the intention and motivation is something you can actually look at. It's something we can study. And how has it changed through mindfulness practice? Attention regulation, stability, control, working memory, bias, and resource allocation. All of these things relate to attention regulation. Emotion regulation, equanimity. How fast can we come back to baseline after an emotional trigger? If we have some sort of traumatic event, and most people perseverate if you have some form of PTSD, for example. If you're perseverating, that's a clinical manifestation. Can you develop a way to actually return back to baseline quickly? That would be more of what we're thinking of as equanimity rather than mindfulness specifically. And allostasis really just refers to homeostatic regulation. Self-specification is a process that some people talk about that specifies the self as a subject agent creating a functional distinction. Basically, it's in contrast to self-reflection. You're gaining a sense of knowing one's automatized patterns of sensory affective motor behavior, including the identification of a personal self-narrative. And what self-specification is really referring to is really being present with present moment experiences versus spending too much time in the narrative. Now, it's not saying that the narrative is bad. There's actually some evidence showing that mind wandering is actually good and increases creativity. So there's two sides of the story. There's some data that suggests that mind wandering is bad and that it could lead to psychopathology. So I think there's a middle ground here. Other processes that we've been talking about is extinction and reconsolidation of these cognitive scripts and schemas, and some of the work that Mo's been talking about specifically relates to this. And then prosociality is something that we really don't talk about much, but when we do these forgiveness practices or metta or loving kindness, they're actually quite profound, and they have profound effects on how we see ourselves and others and how the distinction gets dissolved. And lastly, non-attachment and non-appraisal, also constructs that can be measured. So there's 7 here, but there could possibly be more. See, I don't know how much time we have here, but I was gonna basically give you an idea of what our self, how we can measure self. I don't know, how much time do we have? It's 12:15. Before I get into it too far. Otherwise, I'll try to summarize.
Not too much.
Okay. All right, so the idea here, and I'm not gonna spend much time, 5 minutes. So the idea here is that you have a cat looking at itself in the mirror. The idea here is I really wanted to show you that there's different aspects of different ways, varieties of processing the self. I am, I was, I will be, in an evaluative way, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and this is more of just processing sensory information. You have that is mine, that is me, acting. This is a sense of agency, self-other distinctions. I'm aware that I am, so this is meta-awareness and metacognition. And then you have the non-conscious stuff that's going on under the hood. And really what I wanted to make the distinction here is that we can actually look at each one of these aspects of self-processing and understand the neural substrates that are associated with that and look at how mindfulness affects those. And we're currently testing these models, doing various aspects of imaging techniques to look at them. So I'm gonna skip this. And I'll just say that, again, I'm really just talking about there are substrates for the narrative self, which involves the cortical memory system. There are very specific substrates that you can look at. They're also related to the default mode network. The experiential and phenomenological experience, or just staying in the sensory experience. This involves the yellow structures. And then you have the stuff that's under the hood, the motor stuff, this non-conscious processing. We forget about these things too, but they're actually changing and getting strengthened as well. And then lastly, there are, don't be scared by this, but it's a big slide with lots of stuff on it. But I'm just going to point out that there are networks that integrate the narrative and the phenomenological together. And the integrative stuff is what is really interesting because it involves a lot of these sort of control processes that are being developed and strengthened by mindfulness work. So that's the stuff that's in orange. Things like the DLPFC and the dorsal ACC, frontal polar cortex, dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. These are areas that are part of an integrated frontal parietal control network that will integrate information between the narrative and the experiential. So, and these are actually anti-correlated, meaning that the narrative self is basically, those networks are anti-correlated with the experiential self, and then the integrative network, the stuff in orange, will actually integrate the two. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but not that. Okay, conclusions. So what I really wanted to emphasize here was that mindfulness is multidimensional. It involves a broad framework of neurocognitive component processes underlying a process, a state, dispositional trait. But we're really talking about just how do we reduce suffering and increase flourishing. That's what we're really talking about. And there's multiple things going on when we do these practices. It's supported by very specific practices, concentrative, receptive, and ethical enhancement styles of meditation practice. And so we're really developing a working model supporting 7, maybe 8 component processes underlying self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence. And the contemplative sciences really must work to integrate modern-day historical interpretations of mindfulness while honoring the Western clinical approaches, but while not unwittingly ignoring or dismissing the deepest and most subtle features of the practices from which they originate. And I think that's really critical because we don't want to dilute the actual practice themselves. We really want to go back to the practices and really understand what they're doing at a very subtle level because there's a lot of subtle changes that are happening. So I just hope that the framework that I presented to you today is going to really help sort of for you to conceptualize what mindfulness is really doing and what mindfulness really is and the lack of information that we really have on pinpointing what an actual unidimensional process for mindfulness. So just acknowledge my lab members, David Silberswag and Emily Stern, are the directors of the lab, and then the Boston Contemplative Science Consortium are a group that we meet often, and Shinzen Young, who's been really helpful in doing the work that we're doing together. And thank you. So thanks.